Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Hello, my name is Jeff Lundgren, and I'm a practicing therapist in Salt Lake City and the host for our podcast today. I'm way excited to interview our special guest. Before we get started, there's a couple of things to mention. First, Mormon Mental Health Podcast is sustained only through your donations, and it costs around about $5,000 per year to barely cover the costs. So if you would like to donate, then those donations would go directly to supporting this podcast, and you can do that through our website, which is mormonmentalhealth.org. And if you'd like to do it in non-financial ways, then you can do things like our Facebook page, share links, tell a friend, provide feedback or comment on things you see, or recommend topics that are interesting to you. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Melody Anderson. Melody is a licensed clinical mental health counselor in Utah. And she works, I don't know primarily, but you do work a lot with men and women in domestic violence situations. And she recently spoke at the Utah Domestic Violence Solutions Conference in Provo just last week. And she spoke about how trauma presents in men based on their core values and their beliefs. And what intrigued me the most about what she spoke about is because I work with so many Mormon clients, and I've seen a lot of these things come up in sessions that I do, that I wanted to reach out to her and invite her to come on the podcast, and she could share with us a little bit about what she knows on this topic. So with that, hi, Melanie. Welcome to Mormon Mental Health Podcast.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries. It is my pleasure. I was really excited about this. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Give us a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. I am like you said, a certified mental health counselor. I work with primarily men in the last year. And in the couple years prior, I worked with some women and then all men. So I've worked overseas in Europe, and I've worked with people who are going through trauma. And I have a trauma-informed care certification from Europe. So it kind of like transfers over to the U.S.
Okay.
So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, thank you. And do you come from a Mormon background yourself, or are you kind of a cultural transplant?
So I'm from California. So yes, I'm a cultural transplant. However, I have 4 daughters, and 2 of them went on missions to Russia. Mm-hmm. So I'm very familiar with the LDS culture.
Yeah, I would imagine, especially working in Utah, right?
Yeah, it'd be hard not to be.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to the joke. It's like if you live in Utah, you either are Mormon, you were Mormon, or you might be Mormon at some point.
Right.
Or you'll live next door to one.
Absolutely.
So to start, can you give us a bit of an overview of what trauma is?
Absolutely. And I think where it's interesting, I'm going to say this because my husband asked me recently, like, how do you know you've had trauma? And I said, what do you mean? He's like, well, I heard PTSD just isn't when you get like hurt, or not when somebody dies. It's something bigger than that. And I thought that was really interesting because he's very well cultured. He has a degree. He's a smart guy. And I thought, how does he not know what trauma is? Mm. Trauma actually results and comes from an event that happens in your life. And that event doesn't have to happen to you. It just has to be something that you feel overwhelmed about, that made you feel that your life was threatened or that your loved ones' lives were threatened. And it kind of slowed down your capacity to do what you normally do. Mm. So when I think of trauma, I think this is such a broad category. And a lot of people think that it's very narrow. Car accident, death of the family, trauma is so much more than that.
Yeah. And are there differences in the way the human body or maybe our brain responds to trauma between men and women?
Absolutely. And I think what's fascinating is that our brain structures are so completely different. And there was a study from Harvard in 2016 that talks about the longitudinal fissure. And for everybody out there, don't remember that word. Just think of like the middle part between the two sides of your brain. And for men, it's very big. And it separates the right side from the left side. And for women, it's really small. And what this means is that when men have trauma, they compartmentalize and they look at it like, this happened to me. I need to pretend like it didn't happen, and I need to just move forward. So then if something brings it up, they still try to quantify that trauma into a very linear thought process. How do I take care of it? What do I need to do? Let's move on. The last thing they want to do is what a female wants to do is process it and talk about it and pull it out and feel it and touch it and sit with it. Most guys want to be like, I'm done. We're good. And that's why
men do that, don't they?
Yes, they do. And they don't want to actually do anything. And it's because of our brain structures that do that. Men's brains don't actually connect through their emotional reasoning when they make these like decisions for life. And so when we think about that, women like lies in it, wallows in it, spiderwebs through the emotional reasoning. And men's actually is very linear and thinks, how do I get this done the best way possible with the means that I have and be successful?
Yeah, and I think that's fascinating because it speaks to the ways in which men and women respond to trauma. They're not just gender cultural roles, although that I'm sure that's a part of it, but there's a neurological difference in why men and women may respond different.
Right, and it's interesting when like we will say something like, God, you have such a big fat head, right? Like we joke about that for men, and you do. Your brain is bigger than a female's brain, and it has more gray matter. And I like to think about it this way. When men think about trauma, they think about it like with the spatial awareness that they have. They check the surroundings, see if it's safe to do or respond a certain way, and then they'll respond. Where women are like, who's closest to me? Let me talk to them, but don't answer.
Fascinating. That's interesting. So I would imagine that men and women experience trauma in different types of ways because, in some facets of our experience, men and women do different things. But how is that? Well, what do you see with your clients?
Well, I want to put a spin on this, on how the LDS values actually kind of incorporate and change that view. As a male, if I threw out there, what's the most important thing for you in your church, you may say church, God, Jesus, and then your second answer is always going to be family.
Mm-hmm.
If you experience a trauma and the most important thing to you is your family, and suddenly you can't connect to them, and suddenly there's a wall that you're trying to figure out how to cross over to have those same relationships, but you don't want to admit that you're weak and that you can't be that man of the family right now, that patriarch who takes care of everybody, it's a lot easier just to store that away and worry about it at a time and a place where you're not already doing something important.
So while somebody who may not be Mormon has a family, they may not have the same level of value that a Mormon may have for their family.
Well, and I think that the Mormon Church, and thanks, Jeff, for asking that, and clarifying, I think that LDS Church is so focused on, I like families forever, and it's really ingrained since their very first nursery, right? So in nursery, you guys talk about how family is everything. You have pictures of happy families and the patriarch of the family and the dad taking care of things. So from a very early age, Mormon men are taught that they're going to be in charge, that they're going to take care of their family. And that's the most important thing for them to do, is to make sure that they're okay. So when you suddenly have a trauma and you can't do the one thing you're told your entire life to do, you lose so much. Because men live, and the most important thing to them is their job. And for LDS men, their primary job is their family. Where most non-religious men, it's their actual employment, their job.
That's interesting. And And I think I've experienced that, like as a father, or as a husband, like that's your most important thing. It is.
Absolutely. And when we think that it's not, then we have a problem, right? So we want to make sure that we bring people in and say, you know what, the most important thing to you is something we need to work on, because you can't let it fail if you start putting up walls because of a trauma.
Mm-hmm. So what would be some common things that how men would experience trauma? What type of events are common? Maybe just with men in general, or maybe with LDS men?
Well, I think the biggest event actually is losing your job or losing your family or losing a family member, right? And I say that is because when I talk to men all day. So when I say we, I actually mean men. When men, I know, sorry.
It's okay. It's all good.
When men think of what they have to do and how they're going to move forward, it's never, I can leave it on the side. It's very much, I want to hunt it, kill it, eat it. And so once I've taken care of that, I don't want to have to go back and do it again. So when I'm experiencing trauma, let's say in a relationship where my wife or my significant other is treating me poorly, I might stay because first, family is important. Second, I'm going to lose that ability to say that I have a family. So suddenly I'm not as important as I used to be. And so when it comes to trauma, they may have childhood trauma. They may have teenage trauma. It could be a family member passing away. It could be witnessing domestic violence. It could be food poverty. And when we look at how men respond, they respond by taking that information and saying, I can do it better. Let me see how I'm going to do it. Mm. Let me step in. And it's interesting because men become what I call young adults when they experience childhood trauma. And you'll hear them say things like, I was the man. I had to step up and be the dad. I had to step in and do all the household chores. Mm-hmm. And so they take on a whole different idea. It's no longer expressing emotions and having that play and interactivity with people their age and learning kind of the boundaries of the world and social norms. Instead, they go, I have to adult now. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, they don't say that in their head. They just go, I have a whole bunch of responsibilities and I'm the man of the family. And especially if you're LDS and you learn from nursery that you're supposed to be in charge, that the man is going to be in charge, you will take on that role even more so because that is the role that you're destined to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's this this advancement process that young men experience in church practice where, they're ordained into these priesthood offices and roles and responsibilities. And if the family's disrupted, whether it's their family as a sibling or child, then these things become traumatic. And how do they progress down this unilateral path that's been carved out for them? Now, that's not easy to do anymore.
Right. And what's interesting is that trauma kind of throws like a wrench in the way forward, especially when achieving things like the priesthood. And that's kind of like an expectation where if they don't, that is also a trauma because that is a loss of a title and a role. And so if they are unable to go to church or unable to memorize because their home situation is so chaotic, mm-hmm. they may not progress at the same time as their peers, thus feeling less than. And those are very vulnerable times for young adults. And that's kind of when we say, let's put our arms around them and hold them closer mm-hmm. instead of pushing them away and saying, you better figure this out, go study.
Yeah, that's interesting. And as you describe that and the trauma that young or adolescents experience, I'm thinking about serving a mission. And, it was just a number of years ago where the church lowered the missionary age from 19 to 18. And you have these young men who, and that bar has been, the qualification for a missionary has changed. So the policies, are a little more strict. And I understand why the church would want to do that. But if a young man has, had some, what I would say are normal sexual explorations at their age, right? Or mm-hmm. they confess that they've experienced some amount of pornography, masturbation, those types of topics, then they're prohibited for some period in serving a mission. And now there's this distinction between their manhood in terms of their progression in comparison to friends that are just coming out of high school with them. And I'm curious, does trauma play into this as well?
And I would say, Jeff, that absolutely. When we are unable to move forward as our peers do, or as we believe we were going to do as a young kid, where we have this path. Like my daughter was 6 and was like, I'm going to go and be in the temple with the temple guards. Like she was 6 years old and she knew she wanted to be married in the temple with temple guards. That is from a Nickelodeon show, by the way, the temple guards thing. But it makes me laugh that as early as 6, with a mom who wasn't religious and a dad who was, she still knew her path. So when we roll it over to men, you already see that if I don't go on a mission at the same time, people start to wonder what I've done wrong. Mm-hmm. So now I have to put on a face of this, I'm okay, don't ask me questions, I don't want to answer them, or I'm vulnerable, or I tell them, but no matter what, I'm going to experience trauma because I'm not doing what the norm tells me I'm going to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting.
I think we have to be careful.
Absolutely. And men have more definable milestones than women. I don't know why it's that way, but there seems to be more social aware milestones, right? It's like you're expected to achieve these parts of your progression to certain times in your development.
Right. Your societal norms, right? Mm-hmm. For progression it's marked. We can see it. I mean, your voice drops, you get taller, you get stronger, you start, we see that you get more responsibility. And for women, we just are like, all right, there's nothing changing in your voice. You're just moving along. Mm-hmm. And there's not that visual cue that mm-hmm. people attach to your progression of moving forward.
Mm-hmm. And I'm familiar with the statistics generally, and I'm not sure if we have the numbers for Mormon populations, but men experience physical abuse and sexual abuse just like women do.
Absolutely. And our new study was like 49%, right? Mm-hmm. And women are like 50%. So what's interesting is that we are finally to the point where I think men feel comfortable coming forward. And I think that's really the shift, is that every decade we are getting closer and closer to having people be able to express what's going on. And as our decades pass, we pass that on in our genes to our future offspring, so we can see those changes happening. And so I think that now that we've become more acceptable to all types of people, then we can see that the trauma really is occurring across the board. Mm-hmm. I feel like we're giving people more credence and we are more understanding. Mm-hmm. And we no longer see things like suck it up, buttercup to men and tell girls to show their emotions.
Yeah, right. And I think those trends and the trajectory of accepting, maybe some of this comes out of like the Me Too movement, right? You talked about that. Me Too movement has typically identified with women who have been abused, but I think there is an undercurrent of men wanting to say, and so was I, hello, and raise their hand too.
Right. And what I think people fail to see is that this generational change has really impacted all of us, from males to females. When women stood up and said, don't slap me in the butt, right? Don't catcall me. This is inappropriate. We were able to then kind of push that aside and say, now let's look at our LGBTQ community. Let's look at males. Where are we missing things? Why aren't we looking across the board for every person?
I know that you work with LGBTQ individuals. What sorts of unique challenges do you see regarding trauma, violence, that type of things with either maybe cisgender males or transgender males?
So I first want to say that transgendered men are probably the most vulnerable that I've encountered. What happens is that transgender are often marginalized by the gay community. Men who are gay generally look down at transgendered people because it's kind of like taking that ability to be queer, to be homosexual, and saying that isn't enough. Mm. And so transgender people really feel persecuted in kind of the LGBTQ world. So they even feel less than what a gay man would feel. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting enough is that transgendered men actually, like males to females and females to males, are often used as I'd like to say, kind of like a trial for people who want to try the other sex, but maybe they're not comfortable going all the way. So they'll go out with somebody who's trans, have an encounter and then actually beat them up. And that's why we see a lot of violence. So when I work with transgendered individuals, I find that their violence level is much higher, that their trauma is more deep, intense, and traumatic and really complex. And I don't see that in just the LGBT or LGBTQI world. And it's really just the transgendered who are having a very difficult time in the world right now with trauma because they continue to feel marginalized. And then,
Yeah, some really significant challenges there. And I think these are augmented, these challenges are exacerbated through these cultural beliefs that we have within our Mormon culture around sexuality, right? Or what is good and what is bad, or more judgmental, what does God think is okay and what might be considered, by others as an acceptable alternative.
Yeah. So I have this belief system that says God wants us to do good and be good. And if we don't fulfill those two basic things, then we should probably not open our mouths or do the action. And so when it comes to religion, especially LDS religion, I feel like there's a lot of mixed messages over the years on this is fine, this isn't fine. If you're at an age, it's kind of this wishy-washy world where, my oldest daughter's like, I don't know what I should know. Like, I don't know where the church stands and I don't know how I'm supposed to say or think, but I know that people are people and that we should just treat them kindly. Right. Yeah. And I thought that really kind of settles it. Right. But as a male, in even male to female or female to male in the LDS culture, there's kind of this lack of acceptance of traditional roles. Mm-hmm. And then again, you miss the milestones, you miss like the priesthood, because first they don't know if they're welcome, then they maybe are. Their parents, luckily they have PFLAG and they have like the Mormons for, I can't remember what it's called, the dragons.
Oh, that's the Mama Dragons is for, that's different, or is that what you're thinking of?
No, I'm thinking of like when there's a whole sect of women who are like coming forward and saying, my kid's okay. Like he can be gay.
Yeah, I think that's Mama Dragons.
Yeah, the Mama Dragons, right? Mm-hmm. And so we have these cultures now that are kind of allowing for a conversation to happen to say, you know what, just because this is going on doesn't mean that my son or daughter is less than. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to get away from having somebody dictate right and wrong and start looking at our heart and going, what's the best thing for humanity?
Mm-hmm. And I think that attitude actually helps to assist and this would, I think, apply to men and women, how do we engage in an affirming, supporting way when somebody has experienced a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events, and allowing for some type of acceptance to say, that was horrible and you still have value and I want to hear your story and support you.
Right. And I think what we don't realize is that men marginalize and downplay trauma. And so the last thing they want to do is admit it, or admit it hurts, or admit that it's not easy. And so allowing for a safe space is the first thing we can do, is say, I am open and receptive to whatever you need me for. And, I joke, I often say, you know what, I have the mental health capacity right now to hear whatever you need to tell me, mm-hmm. and really letting them know that I'm good with that. And I feel like I always say we wouldn't need counselors if people would talk to each other. Mm-hmm. Very openly and honestly and be raw, but that is very risky when we don't live in a world where everybody is looking for the kindest part.
Yeah, and there are a lot of judgments. In social connection, how do men that have experienced trauma, do you feel that the types of connections that would be helpful for them come from their family, from women, maybe a mom, a spouse, or female friends, or is this from their male friends, or is there a difference?
So for men, absolutely. Women will automatically go to the women around them and network and listen and share and try to get that relationship kind of going to ensure that they have the support they need. Men in trauma will not go to their family. Their role is a provider, and you can't be a provider who is weak. or who is deemed unstable, or who is deemed depressed. And so when we have these social norms going in our head, most men will look at it and go, all right, I can't even tell my friends. I can't tell my family because I don't want my friends to think that I'm less than them. We are pack creatures. We look for people who hang around with, who are just like us, meaning strong, capable, church-going, holding a job, educated individuals. Whatever our level is who we hang out with. When we show vulnerability, we suddenly become a weaker member of that pack, and then we feel like we don't belong, and we'll take a step down. And this is why you see people, especially men and especially LDS men, drop into really poor behaviors, trying to create defense mechanisms so that they don't have to show anybody, which means that they show people they're not accustomed to be around their trauma by acting out in different ways.
That's remarkable. I could see how a man who's very devout in his faith and for a lack of a better phrase, they want to advance in the priesthood. You know, they want the calling. They want to be the elders quorum president, perhaps even into the bishopric, and then perhaps even into a state calling and leadership, because this is what men do. I wish there were more diversity, but this is the tradition.
Right.
And in that moment where maybe they've been sexually abused, at any phase in their life, how do they come out vulnerable to other men? Because these other men are the ones that are giving them and issuing the callings, and say, yeah, I was sexually abused. I think they might feel, well, that's going to diminish my chances of serving. And they might, put me in a lesser calling, air quotes, lesser, right? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. When we look at men's core beliefs, one of fear of failure is number 2, not being a provider, minimization of their fears, needing to be tough, self-sacrifice. It's the right thing to do to shut up, put up, and work, right? Fear of loss of having that position of power, that position in the church. It's guilt and lack of self-esteem. The last thing they want to do is compound that by talking to somebody who would think any of those things about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. That's what I've seen. I've also seen with men who have been sexually abused more than the physically abused, that this impacts their feeling of worthiness, which is not too different than how women experience that. But I think in some men, there's a level on top of that, because if a man is unworthy from a spiritual perspective, then he's unable to practice and exercise his priesthood role in the home or in his church capacity. And that further complicates his desire to seek out for connection.
Right. And if you can imagine somebody who has been abused or had trauma, and they seek solace in alcohol or drugs or pornography or, any of those kinds of behaviors, then suddenly they're pushing themselves further and further from their actual goals. So then they become more entrenched in their trauma, and now they have additional issues. And so their ability to even talk about it becomes, something they're incapable of doing because they can't show weakness.
Yeah. That these cycles that feed into themselves and become problematic. What kind of tips or things could you offer to men who have experienced trauma, and what can they do to help move them out of those cycles and into a place where they can start their healing journey?
I wish it was different. I wish I could say there's this magical thing you can do in private mm-hmm. and it will take down. We know that journaling actually just re-traumatizes men. So we don't want men to go down this solitary road. There are mental health providers now who do it over over laptops, different screens, over your phone. There's Talkspace. There's so many different avenues now to get mental health without going in to a facility. And so I'd hope that men would seek out those types of things. You also need, in my opinion, 2 confidants who won't judge you and support you and be there for you. And for men especially, they need to find that other male who they can be honest with and know that their trust will be held.
I think that's a really important thing. I've worked with a couple of men's groups where the focus is in creating safety for them to be completely accepted as a man by another man when they feel comfortable in disclosing their experience or experiences.
It's interesting. They'll tell you when you're doing assessments that they've had this kind of trauma, whatever it may be. But when I get them into a group, they'll be like, nah, no, I'm good. No,
Right.
I'm good. and so it takes months. And I think making sure we tell them that we know it takes months, but we want you to keep at it. And so you have to get comfortable. You have to build that rapport. You have to feel safe. And we want you to. But please speak up because we need you to. It's going to help you in the long run.
In fact, this is interesting because one of the groups that I run is a domestic violence group for people who have offended. So, and typically men, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it is remarkable that our treatment strategy does not need to address the harmful behavior of offenders. In many ways, if we just give men a voice, because it's my opinion from my clinical work that men who abuse are also men who have received abuse. It doesn't mean from the same kind of abuse, but they're victims too, in their own way.
Absolutely. And I also do some work with some probationary and parolees, and I have yet to have an assessment. I think I'm somewhere around 2,000 male assessments, yet to have a single person not have a trauma in their childhood.
Yes. And when a man or a young man, let's say, I don't think there's a lot of difference there, experience validation from a peer, then it changes not only the wound that may be the precursor to their behaviors that injured another person, but it also affects both of those things. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Melody, what are some resources that you're familiar with that you could provide here to our listeners?
I think the first thing that we need to do is to have people expect that they are probably holding some trauma with them. So the first resource I would say is yourself, and really get into, what have you been doing, and are you good, and do you feel safe? And if you don't feel safe, I would say the first thing to do is to reach out. And on the internet, you can find so many different support groups. And if you're risky, you can talk to your bishop, but talk to some friends. But more importantly, we can look around and say, get a hold of a group. And you can go to, like, if you're a veteran, there's VFW. If you are looking for, even if you're not comfortable with finding a trauma group, go to your library. There are so many different resources there. So we want to just start at that basic level of looking at, perhaps I need to listen for a while and then move into talking.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And I want to say too, trauma is a very complicated, I don't even want to call it a pathology. I would say it's more of an injury. But it's a very complicated situation, let's say it that way, because we don't just experience trauma or no trauma. We also experience depression, anxiety, struggle, change. There's a large variety of experiences from a mental health perspective. And knowing that, I would say, I think it's very helpful to seek out a professional. And for the leadership within the Mormon Church that listens to this podcast, I would say, connect with professionals that are in your area, and not just within LDS social services, but within the greater community, for people who have specific experience like Melody in working with men and women who have experienced trauma, and add them to the team that you would bring to bear to help and assist your members.
Right. And I know that LDS Family Services has men's support group, and they'll call them like processing groups, and they're very safe groups to go into and build rapport and feel safe and get to know the people in there, and then be able to talk about what's going on in your world or what's happened in your past. And I know that you have to gain that comfort level, but like you said, go quickly and go to a professional. And you can also Google domestic violence help, or you can just Google trauma-informed care in your area, and that will all get you closer to getting the help that I would say you don't know you need, but it would be really worthwhile.
Yeah. And I keep hearing this concept that is probably more prevalent in Mormon populations, that we tend to hide our trauma more than other people would.
When I first came to Utah, I said, does everybody here sweep everything under the carpet? And smile and nod. Because that's how I really felt, was that this is a culture that says, be good at all costs. I will smile, I will do my job, I will just keep moving forward. But that cost now is just really moving forward, and it's compounding. And then we lose people. And I mean that, we lose people because of trauma. They're more apt to commit suicide. They're more apt to isolate. They're more apt to destroy their family without even realizing that it's due to their trauma.
Yeah, that's true. And I think knowing the severity of what trauma does to men within our communities, I think there's a really powerful reframe, because if men take the attitude of let's fix it, let's get this done, let me find a solution, part of that solution, part of the fix is to admit that we've experienced something and we need to connect and create safety so that we can start that process.
Right. And sometimes, like I said before, with men, they don't want to admit that they're less than. But trauma doesn't make you less than. It makes you more than. You have survived and you have persevered and you're moving forward. So let's keep moving forward and find the help that we need.
Absolutely. And trauma doesn't discriminate. It's not like we experience trauma and this personification of this event we'll call trauma says, I think that you're a little more vulnerable, and because you're less of a man, I'm going to hurt you. It just doesn't do that.
No, it doesn't work that way.
No. So I don't, we're all experienced, or excuse me, what I mean to say is we all experience trauma in unique ways, but we all experience trauma because we're people and we all share an experience in the ways in which we live our lives.
Right. And so when we think of trauma, I don't want, again, to think of some catastrophic event. These are small things that kind of rock our world, and everybody experiences it. When people pass away, when your neighbor passes away, when you lose a family pet, these are all traumas. And if you don't have the capability and the relationships to talk about it, they're going to build and build and build and become complex traumas. And so our best bet is to be able to be open and say, look what I've gone through. Let's talk about it. Mm-hmm. And really champion that. Like we've made it this far with the trauma that we've had. Often what happens is that we have these childhood traumas and we become adults and our lives are going well and we think everything is perfect. And suddenly our brain says, oh, you need to deal with this trauma now. And we'll reopen a wound that has not healed. Mm. And suddenly you can have this moment at any point of your adult life where you're re-experiencing these traumas from a youth. And you may wonder why now? And it's generally because everything is going well. Because your brain can say, we can unpack this now. We can talk about this now. We can deal with this now. And so if that's happening to you, realize that's so very normal, but it is time to talk about it now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that will be very helpful for some. Was there anything that maybe we didn't talk about that's important to you or would be helpful for others?
I think what we really need to work on when it comes to trauma is being open to talking about it, not treating it like a taboo, and being open about, you know what, we all have trauma. How are we all doing? And really, inviting those conversations to happen so we can help people move forward. And even as a friend or a peer, somebody you work with can help you guide you because maybe they've had the same experience.
Mm. And I think as friends and family members, as we have other men in our life that come to us in confidence and say, hey, I've really experienced something. I'd like to share it with you. This is an opportunity for all of us, men and women, to open our arms and say, I love you. I care about you as a person. Please tell me your story. You're safe.
Right. And the more we can share our stories, the healthier we are. and the more we're able to change the way we treat people for our future children.
Yeah, this is not just about our individual journey, but this is truly, as much as we honor and respect the family, it's about the opportunity to protect and help our entire family move forward.
Absolutely. And when we think about how much genealogy and heredity and our genes actually impact us as we move forward, we really need to show that we are more compassionate and that we are taking care of these things so our future generations can also take care of those things.
Thank you. That's beautiful. If people have questions or they'd like to reach out to you, how did they find you?
Well, you can reach out to me by email. It's pretty easy, I think, that, it's me. It's melodyjoyd@gmail.com. Again, it's just my name, MELODYJOY, D as in David, @gmail.com.
Thank you. This has been a fantastic interview. I don't know that this particular topic has been addressed so poignantly, and I'm really grateful that you've taken the time to discuss a passion of yours.
Jeff, I really appreciate you inviting me. It's been nice to be able to say, hey, out there, we care. Let's move forward together.
Amen. I love that. So thank you, everybody. Just as a final reminder, again, if you'd like to contribute in financial ways, that is very welcome, even if it's a small amount or non-financial ways to share and help promote our message as we help to engage our community. Those things are all very welcome. Have a wonderful day, and we will talk to you all again soon.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me, unknown way. Before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Her child, thou canst touch the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful twixt me and the peaceful rest. Then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not,